I want you to picture something. You're 70 years old, and you're sitting in a lawyer's office signing the final papers on a marriage that lasted 41 years, and the man across the table from you, your husband for 4 decades, can't even look you in the eye while he signs his own copy. Nobody warned me at 70 that I'd be starting completely over. Not at 30, not at 50. At 70, with a house I no longer wanted to live in alone, and a version of my future I hadn't planned for even once in 4 decades of planning everything else. My name is Diane Porter. I'm 71 years old now, and 18 months ago, after 41 years of marriage, my husband Gerald asked for a divorce. 6 months after that, I sold my half of a house in Charlotte, North Carolina, packed 2 suitcases, and moved entirely alone to a city called Cebu in the Philippines. I want to tell you honestly how a woman who thought she had her whole life figured out ended up starting completely over on the other side of the world at an age when most people assume all your big decisions are already behind you. I need to back up though, because none of this makes any sense without understanding the 41 years that came before it. Gerald and I met at a church picnic in 1982. I was 29, recently finished with my teaching certification, and he was 32, an engineer at a textile company that at the time felt like about as stable a place to build a life around as any. We married 11 months later, raised 2 children, a son named Bradley and a daughter named Michelle, in a modest brick house we bought the same year Bradley was born, and never once considered leaving. I taught middle school science for 33 years at the same school, the kind of teacher former students still stop to say hello to at the grocery store decades later. Gerald worked his way up at the textile company until it got absorbed by a larger conglomerate, at which point he moved into a similar role somewhere else. Steady, unremarkable, the sort of career that quietly supports an entire family without ever making headlines. We weren't a dramatic couple. We didn't fight loudly or often. We built over 4 decades the specific, comfortable rhythm that 2 people build when neither of them expects anything to fundamentally change. Looking back now, I think the marriage had been quietly hollowing out for years before either of us said anything honest about it. Gerald retired 5 years before I did, and something about having all that unstructured time seemed to unsettle him in a way neither of us fully understood at the time. He took up golf obsessively, then dropped it. He started spending long stretches at his brother's cabin a few hours away, alone, he said, just to think. I told myself it was ordinary retirement adjustment. Plenty of men struggle with the transition. I didn't think, not once in those years, that he was quietly deciding our marriage had run its course. The conversation itself, when it finally came, wasn't cruel exactly, which somehow made it worse. We were sitting at our kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday evening, and Gerald set down his fork and said, "Diane, I don't think I want to keep doing this." I asked him what, specifically, he meant, though some part of me already knew. This, us. I think I've known for a while, and I haven't had the courage to say it. I sat there for what felt like an extremely long time. 41 years of shared mornings and shared children and shared everything, condensing down into one ordinary Tuesday sentence. And I remember thinking, with a strange detached clarity, that I had absolutely no idea what my life was supposed to look like starting the next morning. The months that followed were, without question, the hardest of my entire adult life. Harder in some ways than anything I'd braced myself for. There's a particular kind of grief in a divorce after 41 years that people don't talk about enough, because it isn't the grief of death, where at least the world agrees with you that something terrible has happened. It's a quieter, more confusing grief, because the person you're mourning is still very much alive, still living 20 minutes away, still occasionally texting about logistics regarding the house, while an entire imagined future, the one where you grow old together in the same rocking chairs you'd already picked out, simply evaporates without anyone dying at all. I want to be honest about a particular afternoon, because I think it's the moment that actually broke something loose in me, more than the kitchen table conversation itself. About 4 months after Gerald moved out, I went to our favorite restaurant, the one we'd gone to for our anniversary every single year for over 3 decades, out of some stubborn refusal to let him take it from me too. I sat alone at a table for 2, and the waitress, a young woman who'd served us dozens of times over the years, looked at the empty chair across from me with an expression of such obvious, well-meaning pity that I had to excuse myself to the ladies' room simply to cry where she couldn't see me do it. My daughter Michelle, who lives about 40 minutes away with her own family, was wonderful during that stretch, checking in constantly, inviting me over for dinners I mostly picked at without much appetite. My son Bradley, who'd moved out to Denver years earlier for work, called more than he ever had before. Careful and a little awkward, the way sons sometimes are when their mothers are hurting in ways they don't quite know how to address. Both of them, in their own ways, seemed to expect that I would simply settle, eventually, into the role of the divorced older woman, the one who takes up a hobby, maybe joins a book club, quietly shrinks her life down to fit the smaller shape everyone assumes a woman my age is supposed to occupy after something like this happens to her. I want to be clear that I didn't arrive at the idea of actually leaving the country in some single dramatic moment. It built slowly, almost despite myself, over the better part of 8 months. It started, oddly enough, with my hairdresser of nearly 15 years, a woman named Angela, who mentioned, while working on my color one Tuesday, that her own mother had moved to the Philippines 2 years earlier after a similarly difficult divorce, and seemed, by every account Angela gave me, remarkably content there. I went home that evening and, purely out of a kind of restless curiosity I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember, started reading. One search led to another, the way it does, and within a couple of weeks I was up until midnight most nights reading expat forums, watching videos of retired American women living all over the Philippines, in Manila, in smaller towns, in a city on an island called Cebu that kept coming up as a particularly popular landing spot for exactly the kind of fresh start I was, without fully admitting it to myself yet, beginning to consider. I learned about a retirement visa available to foreigners over 50. I ran the numbers on my modest teacher's pension and Social Security, numbers that in Charlotte felt tight and worrying, and that, stretched across a completely different cost of living, suddenly looked entirely different. I didn't tell Michelle or Bradley anything at first. I simply kept reading, kept researching, kept turning the idea over quietly on my own, the way you do with something you're not yet sure you have the nerve to actually follow through on. After about 6 months of this, I decided on something small and containable, Just a trip. 2 weeks. I'd see it with my own eyes. And if it turned out to be nothing more than a fantasy I'd built up in the loneliest stretch of my life, I would come home and never mention it to another soul. I told my children I was taking a trip with a friend from my old teaching days, which wasn't entirely a lie, since Angela's mother, a warm, no-nonsense woman named Priscilla, had offered, once Angela mentioned my situation to her, to meet me there and show me around for a few days. When Michelle asked exactly where, I told her Southeast Asia, and I watched her expression shift through several stages of concern before settling into a careful, worried politeness. "Mom, are you sure that's safe, going somewhere like that alone?" I told her I'd traveled plenty in my life, and I was a grown woman perfectly capable of making my own decisions. She let it drop, but I could tell it stayed with her. I flew out of Charlotte in the early spring. North Carolina in that particular stretch of the year is still gray and unsettled. Not quite winter, not quite anything else, which felt like an apt reflection of exactly where I was in my own life. 20-some hours later, I landed in Manila first, spent 2 disoriented nights there getting accustomed to the heat and the noise every visitor to that airport seems to experience on arrival, and then took a short flight south to Cebu, where Priscilla was waiting for me, holding a hand-lettered sign with my name spelled correctly, which she later told me she'd double and triple checked, since Angela had apparently warned her I might be nervous enough about the whole trip that a misspelled name could send me straight back to the ticket counter. Cebu surprised me from the very first drive out of that airport. I braced myself, from things I'd read, for something close to complete chaos. And what I found instead was a sprawling, genuinely lively city, busier and more developed than I'd expected, with a mix of gleaming shopping districts and older, more residential neighborhoods tucked in behind the main roads. Priscilla put me up in a modest guest house for those first few days in a neighborhood called La Hougue, and that first evening she took me to a rooftop restaurant that looked out over the city, and in the distance, a stretch of the ocean turning gold as the sun went down. I remember sitting there with a cold glass of San Miguel, a local beer Priscilla insisted I try, thinking, for the first time in longer than I could measure, that I felt something other than the low, grinding sadness that had been my constant companion for the better part of a year. Not happiness exactly, something closer to curiosity, a feeling I hadn't fully experienced since long before Gerald and I had our conversation at that kitchen table. Priscilla introduced me around over those 2 weeks. Her neighbor Corazon, a widow a little older than me, who'd built an entire second act for herself, running a small English tutoring service for local children. A young woman named Lourdes, who managed a coffee shop near the guest house, and by my 3rd visit had already started preparing my order the moment she saw me walk in. I toured a large private hospital called Changhua, mostly because I knew Michelle would ask about it eventually, and I made a point of getting the actual figures. A general consultation ran around 1,500 pesos, less than $30, a number that struck me as almost unbelievable compared to what an equivalent visit cost me, even with Medicare back home. By the end of those 2 weeks, I knew, in the particular quiet way you know something before you fully admitted it to yourself in words. I flew home to Charlotte and sat with the decision for nearly 2 months before I acted on it at all, because I've never in my life been a woman who makes major decisions impulsively, not even ones that felt, somewhere underneath the caution, absolutely necessary. I made lists, what I'd be leaving, what I might actually gain. I thought about my grandchildren, about the house I'd need to formally sell my half of once the divorce settlement finalized. And then I thought about that rooftop, the sun going down over the water, the specific, unfamiliar feeling of curiosity I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember, and I called a realtor about my half of the settlement. People often ask me for the actual numbers once they hear this story, so let me give them honestly, because I think specifics matter more than vague reassurance. My apartment in Banilad, a modest but comfortable one-bedroom, runs me around 14,000 pesos a month, somewhere close to $250. Utilities, groceries, the occasional dinner out with Corazon bring my total monthly expenses to somewhere around 50,000 pesos, just under $900. My teacher's pension combined with Social Security covers that comfortably, with room left over most months that simply never existed in Charlotte, where property taxes alone on the house Gerald and I shared ran more than my entire monthly budget does here. Michelle found out during a Sunday dinner when I mentioned, as casually as I could manage, that I'd been looking into long-term visa options for the Philippines. She put her fork down slowly, the way I recognized immediately as the exact gesture Gerald had used at our own kitchen table not so long before, and said, "Mom, what exactly are you telling me right now?" I told her the truth. I was planning to move there, permanently, once my half of the house sale went through. She stared at me for a long moment, then said, quietly, "First Dad leaves, and now you're leaving too." That landed harder than almost anything else said to me during that entire period, and I sat with it in the car the whole drive home. Bradley's reaction, when Michelle inevitably called him that same night, was different, more clinical, more concerned with logistics than emotion, which is simply how Bradley has always processed difficult things. He called me directly the next morning with a list of questions. Did I understand how far away that actually was? What would I do if I needed medical care quickly? Did I have any actual support system there beyond a few people I'd met over a 2-week vacation? I answered every question as honestly and thoroughly as I could, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before saying, "Mom, this feels sudden." I told him it hadn't felt sudden to me at all, that I'd been quietly turning it over for the better part of a year, since roughly the same week his father had decided our marriage was over. I sold my half of the house 3 months later, once the settlement fully finalized. I kept a small storage unit near Michelle's place for the things that actually mattered. Photographs mostly, a box of items from my classroom I couldn't bring myself to part with after 33 years of teaching. Michelle came around, gradually, in the weeks before I left, not fully in agreement, but at least in a kind of resigned support. Bradley remained more guarded, though he did call the night before my flight, which I hadn't necessarily expected. "Be careful, Mom. Please call the second you land." I told him I would. I flew out on a one-way ticket in early autumn, 70 years old, alone, toward a city I'd only visited once for 2 weeks, with a version of my future that neither Gerald nor I, nor either of our children, had ever once discussed as a real possibility across 4 decades of careful, predictable planning. The apartment I'd arranged, a modest one-bedroom in a neighborhood called Banilad, not far from where Priscilla lived, felt considerably more real once I was standing in it alone with my 2 suitcases than it had felt as photographs on a rental website months earlier. The building's caretaker, a soft-spoken woman named Baby, showed me around, pointed out the nearest sari store, and that evening, unprompted, knocked on my door with a plate of pancit, a Filipino noodle dish, saying simply, "You did not eat yet, I think." I sat alone in that unfamiliar apartment, eating food a stranger had prepared for me without my asking, and I cried, not entirely from sadness, but from the specific shock of being cared for by someone who owed me absolutely nothing, at exactly the point in my life when I'd started to believe that particular kind of care was reserved only for people who still had an intact marriage to provide it. The first month was harder than I let on to either of my children. I didn't know how to navigate the jeepneys yet, the colorful minibuses that serve as the city's main transit, and I got overcharged twice by taxi drivers before Corazon, Priscilla's neighbor, gently explained the fare rates so I'd know better going forward. There were mornings I woke in that unfamiliar bedroom and simply lay there, not sad exactly, just entirely unmoored, the particular disorientation of being 70 years old and starting completely over from nothing in a life that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the one I'd spent 41 years quietly assuming was permanent. What actually broke through that loneliness wasn't a single dramatic moment, but the accumulating, ordinary kindness of people who had no reason at all to bother with me. Lourdes at the coffee shop, who by my second month had my order memorized down to the exact amount of sugar. A tricycle driver named Nonoy, who began waiting near my building most mornings around 8 without my ever asking him to, simply because he'd noticed my routine. And Corazon, the widow from Priscilla's neighborhood, who showed up at my door one Saturday morning holding 2 cups of coffee and said, "Come, I am going to show you the market the tourists never find." That was the entire invitation. No scheduling, no hesitation, simply an assumption that I would come, and I did. I want to describe one particular evening from those first difficult weeks, because I think it captures something the general loneliness doesn't fully explain on its own. About 3 weeks in, I had a minor plumbing issue. A leaking pipe under my kitchen sink that, back in Charlotte, Gerald would simply have handled without either of us discussing it. One of those small marital divisions of labor you don't notice until it's suddenly, entirely yours alone to solve. I stood in my kitchen at 10 at night with a flashlight and a growing puddle, feeling a specific, outsized despair that had less to do with the pipe itself and more to do with the sudden, total absence of anyone whose job it had once been to fix such things. I knocked finally on baby's door downstairs, apologizing profusely for the hour, and within 20 minutes she'd not only helped me shut off the water, but called her own brother-in-law, a plumber, who came by the very next morning before 8 and fixed the whole thing for a price so modest I tried unsuccessfully to pay him double. It was such a small thing, a leaking pipe, but I sat afterward at my kitchen table and cried for almost 20 minutes, not from sadness exactly, but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of discovering that being alone here did not actually mean being unsupported. Corazon became, in a way I genuinely hadn't anticipated, one of the closest friendships I've built in years. Closer in some ways than friendships I'd maintained for decades back in Charlotte. She'd lost her own husband 9 years earlier, and like me, had spent a long stretch afterward believing her most vital years were already behind her. We were, in our own particular way, two women arriving at the same loneliness from entirely different directions, mine through abandonment, hers through death. And somehow that difference made the friendship deeper rather than shallower. We fell within a few months into a rhythm neither of us had planned, but both of us seemed to need. Saturday mornings belonged to the market. Most evenings, at least a few times a week, one of us would simply appear at the other's door with dinner, no scheduling required, an easy familiarity I hadn't experienced with a friend since long before Gerald and I settled into the particular self-sufficiency that 4 decades of marriage tends to produce. Corazon told me one evening several months in that after her husband died, several of her own married friends had quietly drifted away, uncertain how to include a widow in the couple's dinners and holiday gatherings that had structured their social lives for years. It is strange, she said, how being alone can make people who are not alone uncomfortable, as if it might be contagious. I told her I understood that exactly, having watched several of my own longtime friends in Charlotte grow oddly distant after Gerald left, unsure, I suspect, which one of us to remain loyal to. It was Corazon who eventually pulled me into the volunteer English tutoring program she'd been running for years out of a community center near her home, working with local teenagers preparing for university entrance exams. I'd spent 33 years teaching middle school science, and some part of me assumed those particular skills had gone permanently unused the moment I retired. I was wrong. The very first Saturday I volunteered, a serious, quiet 17-year-old named Angelica stayed behind after the session ended, wanting extra help preparing for an upcoming scholarship interview. And we sat together for nearly an hour working through her nervous, halting answers until she found something close to real confidence in her own voice. Over the following months, that Saturday program became the genuine center of my week, the same way I suppose my classroom once was. I watched Angelica's confidence grow week over week, watched her eventually secure a partial scholarship to a university in Manila, and I felt, standing in that community center the day she told me the news, a version of pride I hadn't expected to feel again at 71 years old, thousands of miles from the classroom that had defined most of my working life. About 6 months in, I had my first real test of whether this new life could hold up under genuine pressure, in the form of a typhoon that hit the region harder than anything the locals said they'd seen in several years. The warnings had been building for days, and I found myself, true to form, buying enough canned food and bottled water to survive what felt like a month, while Corazon watched me stock my kitchen with amused patience. "You are very serious about this, Diane," she said, not unkindly. The storm arrived that evening, wind bending the palm trees outside my window sideways, and the power went out around 8, plunging the whole building into a humid, unfamiliar darkness. I sat alone in that dark apartment for perhaps 20 minutes, genuinely frightened in a way I hadn't expected to be, before there was a knock at my door. It was Baby, holding a candle in a jar, telling me the building's covered ground floor walkway was safer and considerably cooler, and that several neighbors were already gathered there. I went down and found perhaps a dozen people sitting together on the concrete steps, children running around with flashlights, someone's portable radio playing through the static, and nobody making any particular fuss over the fact that I was there. Someone simply handed me a bowl of something cold and sweet and made room. I sat out there for nearly 3 hours while the storm did its worst, and at some point, listening to strangers laugh together about a leaking roof 2 doors down, I realized that the specific, isolating loneliness I'd carried through my entire marriage's final year had genuinely loosened its grip, if only for that one storm-lit evening. The power came back around midnight, and the next morning, without any coordination or announcement, neighbors were simply out clearing fallen branches together, checking on each other the way I imagine communities everywhere once did before everyone's lives grew so separately scheduled. I thought, walking back up to my apartment that morning, about how differently that same storm would have played out in my old house in Charlotte in the year after Gerald left, when a power outage would simply have meant sitting alone in the dark with nobody to knock on my door at all. About 8 months into my time in Cebu, Michelle finally came to visit, more out of what I suspect was genuine worry than actual curiosity at that point. She landed guarded, the way I imagine anyone would after months of hearing about my new life only secondhand over video calls. I showed her everything: the market with Corazon, the Saturday tutoring program, Lourdes at the coffee shop, who greeted Michelle by name within her second visit simply because I'd mentioned her so often. We visited Changhua Hospital together, and Michelle, ever practical, asked pointed questions about emergency care and specialist availability that the administrator answered thoroughly and patiently. The moment that shifted something in her happened on her fourth day, walking back from the market, when we ran into Angelica, who threw her arms around me the way she always does now and immediately launched into an update about her upcoming exams. Michelle watched the whole exchange quietly, and later that evening, sitting on my small balcony as the sky went from orange to violet, she said, "I thought you were running away from what happened with Dad." I asked her what she thought now. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Now I think maybe you were finally running towards something that was actually yours. Not something you built with him, something entirely yours." I didn't have a ready answer for that, so I simply reached over and took her hand. The same gesture I realized only afterward that Gerald had once used across our kitchen table to end everything, and that Corazon had once used, unprompted, to begin something new for me instead. Bradley came about 5 months after Michelle did, more guarded going in, true to his practical nature, with a genuine list of questions he'd clearly been saving up since our very first phone call about the move. He wanted to see the hospital himself, in detail, and I walked him through Changhua exactly as I had with his sister, watching him ask the administrator increasingly specific questions about emergency response times and specialist referrals until he'd apparently satisfied whatever internal checklist he'd arrived with. He wanted to understand the visa situation thoroughly, the actual legal protections I had as a foreign resident, and I answered every question as patiently as I could, recognizing in his careful, methodical worry an echo of exactly the same caution he'd shown as a boy, checking twice that every door was locked before he could fall asleep. The shift in him came, unexpectedly, at the Saturday tutoring program, where Angelica, now preparing for her upcoming move to university in Manila, had brought a rough draft of her scholarship application essay to show me one final time before submission. Bradley sat quietly through the whole session, watching this 17-year-old girl who wasn't his mother's daughter or granddaughter, treat me with the kind of easy, genuine affection he'd rarely seen anyone show me back in Charlotte, where our extended family had grown comfortable over the years, treating me mostly as a fixture rather than a person with her own unfinished ambitions. Afterward, walking back to my apartment, he was quiet for a long stretch before saying, "I didn't know you still had this in you, Mom. The teaching. I thought that ended when you retired." "So did I for a while," I told him. "Turns out it didn't." On his last evening, sitting with me on my small balcony, he said something I hadn't expected from my more reserved, careful son. "I think Dad assumed you'd just fade into the background after the divorce. I think I assumed that too, honestly." I asked him what he thought now, watching the sky over Cebu go from orange to the deep violet I'd come to love more than almost anything else about my evenings there. "Now I think you're the only one of the two of you who actually went and built something new," he said. "Dad just moved into a smaller version of the same life. You built an entirely different one." I hadn't expected from Bradley, of all people, to feel quite so understood. It's been just over a year now since I signed those divorce papers without Gerald able to meet my eyes. And 18 months since I sold my half of the house I'd assumed I would grow old and die in. My children don't worry the way they once did. Michelle visits now more than she ever did when I lived 20 minutes from her in Charlotte, which strikes me still as one of the stranger ironies of this whole experience. Bradley, always the more guarded one, has started asking practical questions not about whether I'm safe, but about visa requirements for himself, half joking, in a tone I suspect isn't entirely a joke at all. I wake up most mornings in my small apartment in Banilad. I make 1 cup of coffee, occasionally 2 now, since Corazon has taken to knocking on my door most weekends before our walk to the market. Saturdays belong to the community center and a room full of eager, ambitious teenagers who have, without my fully realizing when it happened, become as central to my week as my own classroom once was for 33 years. And most evenings I sit on my small balcony and watch the sky change color over a city I'd never once considered, not for a single moment, across 4 decades of careful, predictable planning, with a man who ultimately decided on an ordinary Tuesday that our shared plans no longer suited him. I'm not going to tell you that Cebu is some kind of magic cure, because it isn't. And grief, whatever form it takes, doesn't disappear just because you've changed the scenery around it. There are still evenings I think about Gerald, about 41 years that ended not with cruelty exactly, but with a kind of quiet abandonment that I suspect I'll still be working through for years to come. I miss my grandchildren more than I let on most days. The bureaucracy here can be genuinely maddening, and the heat, some afternoons, defeats me entirely. But I've gained something too, something I don't believe I would have found if I'd simply stayed in Charlotte, taken up the hobby, joined the book club, quietly shrunk my life down to the smaller shape everyone assumed I'd occupy after the divorce. I've gained Corazon, a friendship built from 2 very different kinds of loss. I've gained Angelica and a whole room of students who greet me every single Saturday like my showing up genuinely matters. I've gained the particular hard-won confidence of knowing that at 70 years old, with a marriage of 4 decades ending in 1 ordinary sentence at a kitchen table, I was still entirely capable of building something new, alone, on the other side of the world. If there's one thing I'd want another woman to hear, sitting somewhere right now, staring down her own version of an unexpected late life ending, it's this. Nobody warns you that you might have to start completely over at 70. But nobody tells you either that you're still entirely capable of it if you're willing to get on the plane. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd like the video and subscribe. There are more stories like mine, and I think you'll find them worth the time. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next.